want to thank you again for coming and participating in this series that we're doing on Genesis 1 through 11. We left off at the period of time between the fall of man in Genesis 3, and we finished up in 5 and 11 with the genealogies. Today we're going on to look at the flood of Noah. God created two creatures in his image. One is angels and men. Angels appear to be created before man. Satan was created, we know, as a perfect creature because he's there at the temptation of Adam and Eve. So we know from Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28 that he was created perfect in the original. However, by the time he comes to the temptation of Eve and then Adam, he's a fallen creature. Angels are spiritual. They're not made of matter or energy as our physical realm is. They're immortal. They never age. Gabriel, for instance, one of the angels, appears to Daniel in the book of Daniel, and he appears 600 years later to Mary, the mother of Jesus, and he's the same creature. He hasn't aged at all. So we know that the angels don't age. However, some of them have fallen into sin, as we have pointed out with Satan, is at least one of them. And his angels are talked about as having fallen too, those that obeyed him and fell with him. However, with their sin, there is no redemption to undo this sin. There's no atonement, even by the angel of God, who is evidently a pre-incarnate Christ. He appears periodically in the scriptures. He's not like the other angels. He allows himself to be worshiped. But this angel of God can't die either, because the angels can't die. And the penalty for sin is death. And so there's no possibility of redemption for the angels. They have the lake of fire. We know from Christ in Matthew 25 that according to Jesus, their ultimate destiny is the lake of fire, which has no occupants at the present time. They're masculine in gender. They always appear as masculine with masculine pronouns. There are no female angels. There's no marriage between angels, and they don't procreate to produce baby angels, contrary to the pictures you often see of cherubs. Cherubs are a different creature, special type of angels. These angels interact with God. You see this in the case of Job, at the beginning of Job, when the sons of God appear before God, Satan is among them. These are not the spirit of departed people that are coming before God's presence, and they interact with God, and they accuse believers before the throne of God. Satan does day and night. You also have the case where Ahab was to be led up to die at Ramoth Gilead, and God has a convocation of spirits, and part of these are unfallen angels, and part of them are fallen angels. So in this case, there's an interaction and feedback between God and his angels. They can also, in the present day, possess people, because we have them appearing in the New Testament, in Christ casting them out as demons or unclean spirits. These are obviously servants of Satan and his angels, and they indwell people and possess them. Judas, for instance, is indwelt by Satan in the temptation and leading to the death of Christ. Men, in contrast to angels, are mortals. They have sinned, in the case of Adam and Eve, and fallen, but they're redeemed by the God-man, Christ Jesus. They're created in two parts, men are. In contrast to angels, there's masculine and feminine union that happens between males and females, and they produce babies in this union. It's forbidden for men to participate in homosexuality, men with men and women with women. It wasn't Adam and another man, and it wasn't Eve and another woman. But God made this union of marriage between them in two parts, probably in some reflection of his nature that exists a fellowship in the Godhead between the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. It's not a carnal union as you have with humans, but it's a similarity where there's a fellowship between man and a woman. As we've mentioned, it's forbidden to have homosexual or bestiality relationships with animals. It's forbidden. Before the fall, you have a perfect relationship between God and man, a perfect universe, as we've seen He created in Genesis 1 and 2. However, the entrance of the fallen angels, who are also created in God's image, in the case of Satan, caused man to fall from his relationship with God. So this interaction between the angels and men, both created in the image of God, leads to a catastrophic failure on man's part and in God's judgment to bring the whole universe down. We see, though, even in this relationship that man has lost with God, the universe is caught in the problem of sin and corruption. But the world that was still after the fall, even though there's the Garden of Eden and it's guarded by a cherub with a sword so they can't enter it, the rest of the world is very lush. It's full of animal and plant life. It's a very beautiful place. It had a uniform temperature. You didn't need clothes, but clothes were worn to cover the nakedness of man. But it was a very warm and lush environment. Man had almost an ideal condition compared to what we have today. And this continued from the fall until Noah. However, a problem began to develop in man. Now, men had known, because of the longevity, Adam lived to the time of Lamech, who is the grandfather of Noah, which meant that everyone, for all these generations, knew what had taken place in the Garden of Eden. They knew the problem of sin. However, they were not paying attention during this period of time. They were enjoying this luxurious thing, eating, drinking, and having a great time. However, their sin began to develop. And this is characteristic of man. He has good environments, and what does he do with them? You see it in Israel. You see it in man after the flood of Noah, where they have a good environment. However, this materialism, the enjoying of the senses, the food and everything, causes man to not trust in God and to turn away. In this environment that existed before the flood of Noah, in fact, it became bad. And we have, even before Noah, Enoch, a man of God who served God, who became a preacher, we know, and told them that judgment's coming for ungodly people who will suffer judgment. And in the end, God took him out of the world. He was the first man to be translated. There's only two in history that we know of, Enoch, and then afterwards, Elijah. Only two men have been translated. But he warned them, don't enjoy this world. Turn back to God. But that was not to be. Let's read in Genesis 6, 1 through 9. Now it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, the daughters were born to them. Okay, men begin to multiply. How did they multiply? By marriage between a man and a woman. Was there anything wrong with that? No, that was perfect. Daughters were born to them. In verse 2, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all that they chose. Now, this term sons of God is used in the Old Testament, not of humans. It's generally used almost exclusively of angels. So you have a strange thing occurring here. This marriage, you ask, what's the problem with a marriage between the sons of God and the daughters of men? God ordained marriage, but there's something unholy about this marriage. Because God then says in verse 3, and the Lord said, my spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh. Yet his days will become 120 years. Why that's significant is up to this time, the longevity of man has been over 900 years old. They're going to be chopped down to 120 years. But there's more that to this problem of why God is angry. There were giants on the earth in those days, and afterwards, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. And these are the mighty men of old, men of renown. What you have here is that coming out of this union between the sons of God and the daughters of men are offspring that are men of renown. They're giants. Nephilim is the term that's used. This union is the primary cause, it looks like, of God's anger. Then God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man, and he was grieved in his heart. So the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping things and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. So you have a state that God is very unhappy with his creation and what they've done. Is he angry that they married? No. But it's an unholy union that has taken place that's beyond what he's said. However, it says, there's a beautiful phrase here. It says, but Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Enoch was not the only holy man. Noah, a descendant of his, is also a man who found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Now, I'd like to jump to a couple passages in the New Testament which explain exactly what this type of a union was that God was so angry with. In 2 Peter 2, verses 4 and 5, it says, for if God did not spare the angels who sinned, so he didn't spare these angels that sinned. What kind of sin is it? Women, according to 2 Jude and Peter. The punishment for the fallen angels who gave themselves over to sexual immorality and went after strange flesh, he's still free. Were the other angels free? Yes, they are. But there's a certain class of angels that were not free, that sinned of a kind that God was not happy and threw them in chains. But look at the contrast. But did not spare the ancient world. In other words, the time of the sin of these angels was during the ancient world, but saved Noah, one of 8 people, a preacher of righteousness, it calls him, Noah, bringing the flood in the world on the ungodly. In other words, these angels sinned in the ancient world, but God preserves Noah out of this. Again, the very strong indication is here that these sons of God, these angels, had crossed the lines and gone after strange flesh. Angels don't marry with angels, but that does not preclude that masculine angels cannot have relationships with women and produce offspring. Jude is even more clear, 6 and 7, verse 6, and the angels who did not keep their proper domain, but left their own abode, he is reserved in everlasting chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day. And then he compares that. He talks about the same type of angel, the same group of angels that Peter's talked about, but he goes on. As Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them, listen to this, in similar manner to them. In similar manner to who? To the angels. Having given themselves over to sexual immorality and gone after strange flesh. Sodom and Gomorrah, in fact, our terms of sodomy laws have to do with homosexuality, crossing this line, not marriage of men and women, but homosexual relationships, and they gave themselves over to strange flesh. It says, in like manner to these angels who also did the same thing, and are set forth as an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire. The sexual union of the sons of God, a term used, as I said, exclusively of angels in the Old Testament, such as in Job, and the daughters of men, this union with the daughters of men, is the point of God's wrath and his determination to destroy all of earth's animals, including all men except those of on Noah's ark. This sexual union was an unholy one, not the man-woman relationship ordained by God in Genesis 1 and 2. And it appears to be between masculine fallen angels and female women, according to 2 Jude and Peter. The punishment for the fallen angels who gave themselves over to sexual immorality and went after strange flesh is that they are now locked up in chains and darkness until the judgment of the great day. The product of this unholy union were Nephilim. This punishment of mankind and the offspring of this unholy union results in the destruction of the whole human race, except for Noah, who found grace in the eyes of the Lord. I'd like to go back, though, to the world before Noah, the one that was created in the beginning, and some of the characteristics. The waters above. It says, let there be a firmament, and I'm going to concentrate on what this world was like, and the waters above are prominent in this because they don't exist today. Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. That's in Genesis 1:6. The waters above, it says, thus God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. This is in Genesis 1:7. This takes place in the second day. The atmosphere, and I take the firmament as being the atmosphere, divides the waters below from the waters above. This would form a water canopy. The waters above was probably of water vapor rather than a solid like ice or a liquid form. And it would surround the earth above the present atmosphere. The waters above supplied some of the flood waters because it says the windows of the heavens were open in Genesis 7:11, as the water canopy collapsed as rain during the time of the flood. The effects of the waters above in the atmosphere before the flood had several effects. One, you'd have a moderate reflection of solar radiation and a moderate greenhouse effect of the water canopy, providing a mild, semi-tropical climate for abundant plant and animal life, and this would be over the whole earth, including the poles, North and South poles. There were not polar regions in this type of an atmosphere. There'd be a uniform temperature over the whole earth, such as you have on Venus. You would have the same temperature at the poles as you have at the equator. Fossils of all sedimentary layers, except the recent ones like the Pleistocene, show uniform global temperatures. There would be no rain from weather fronts colliding because there's no temperature differences and no temperature zones. Also, without temperature differences, there would probably be no strong winds but very gentle breezes in the earth. Other effects from the waters above. The water canopy will protect from very strong solar radiation, and you'll have less DNA damage and longer life for plants and animals as a consequence. The atmospheric pressure, because of the canopy above, the water weight in vapor form, would increase and would be higher than today, and it would be created by the additional weight of the canopy waters. An example is Venus's heavy canopy, and theirs is more than 90 times higher than the Earth's. And they only have about twice the radiation that we have. So we could probably contain an atmosphere of water pressure of 50 times of our present atmosphere. I would suspect that it's less than that, and I'll give you a reason here shortly. Giants and in plants and animals could exist in this hyperbaric pressure. That means a high pressure atmosphere, which would allow for higher body metabolism for larger animals and denser air for flight of the large animals too. Let me give you an example. When we increase the atmospheric pressure at the surface of sea level, for instance, an athlete can run a lot better because he has more oxygen. If you take him up to the top of a high mountain like Pikes Peak, his performance drops tremendously down with the same athlete because he's lost atmospheric pressure. The oxygen goes down. But if you have a supercharged one, then you have a lot more oxygen to carry on metabolism. You can run stronger. You can perform a lot better. A bird, for instance, could generate a lot more energy to fly. Also, the heavier air would allow the birds to fly too. They would have air to get aerodynamic lift. Particularly in this atmosphere, animals like reptiles and plants like trees would continue to grow. There's no limit to the size they get. The older they are, the bigger they get. And so if you have longevity from DNA, protection from solar radiation, you have better oxygen, hyperbaric pressures, then you'll also extend life. In fact, hyperbaric pressures are used in special clinics to heal people. Your healing takes place a lot better. You'll live a lot longer in these type of heavier atmospheres. So this is the world before. Let's look at the seas that exist, because we know that the world was divided into sea and land. And there was probably like a Pangea, one big continent, and the rest was seas. But the seas, however, before the flood were probably shallow, since subsurface features of our present oceans indicate that they were exposed to the atmosphere with much lower ocean levels at one time. Seas before the flood probably covered a much smaller proportion of the Earth's surface. Presently, 70% of the Earth's surface is covered with ocean, and over half of it, over 50% of the oceans, are more than a mile deep. And I'm just making this as an assumption, but it appears that the oceans, because we know that they were a lot lower at one time, covered a much smaller portion of the earth. Land, on the other hand, would have several other features. Since the Lord in the future, we know, like Isaiah 54:9, will bring down the mountains in the future because of their haughtiness, the original created earth probably had no mountains or hills. The number of animal and plant life species in the Genesis creation were much more numerous than today. As fossil records indicate, there are probably 100 times more species than exist today. The land before the flood was watered, it appears, by subterranean water sources without rain, because it says very clearly a mist came up from the ground to water the plants because there was no rain in those days. Also, all the plants and animals from the Genesis we know were created according to their kind. Why this is very important is, one, this inability of flora and fauna species of mixing with other species would produce an infinite and probably a very deadly variety of species combinations. For instance, an extreme case was an elephant's snout on a mosquito or something of that extreme. Whereas if they could crossbreed, this would produce these very unusual characteristics, but those acquisition of those characteristics would cause every species to die, because they have very special characteristics, each species to live in a certain environment. If it loses any of those, it will die off. These genetic walls of separation, according to their kind, between species makes the evolution of new species impossible, contrary to modern evolutionary thinking, especially where a male and female of each species is necessary to propagate a species. They'd have to occur at the same time on the earth, the male and the female. They have to be approximately the same age, and they happen to have to breed to produce the new species, because they can't breed back to their progenitor if they came from that. Almost all of the species that we have on the earth exist without change today. And that's why you have some of evolutionary's most ancient species are alive today and unchanged, they say, as living fossils. But all the species are set up so that there's, in the geological records, you have no intermediate forms between species. You should have a continuum if evolution was true. But God didn't create them that way. He made them with sharp barriers so that they can't produce either evolution nor this infinite variety of crossbreeding that would destroy almost every species if they did that. We do know from fossil records that giants in plants and animals existed. just like this would be the case with this hyperbaric pressure. And you find animals, for instance, dinosaurs that are 80, and animals that are 80 to 100 tons. Well, the largest one we can sustain now is about a 6-ton elephant. It gets much bigger, it'll run out of oxygen. Like a whale gets beached on there, it breathes there. It's not out of its element, but it's out of its water, but it'll die because its lungs and everything are not built to the capacity to live in present-day atmospheric pressures. We also know that 99% of all species, again from the fossil records, have become extinct. And there's only 1% of the original creation remains today. Fossil records in the sedimentary rocks indicate that plants and animals in the pre-Noahic, this is before Noah, flood creation, were spread with a uniform temperature over the earth. For instance, at the equator, you find the same fossils that you find in Antarctica and Arctic. They had the same temperature and living conditions. We have huge coal beds of extinct. Now, semi-tropical and tropical plants are found worldwide. They're all the same, including Antarctica and Arctic regions. Antarctica has probably the largest coal beds today formed out of tropical plants, lycopods. And they're extinct, but what are they doing growing down there where you can't even get trees to grow or grass or anything else? It's because the world was uniform at that time. Many extinct animals, such as the mammoth, mastodons, saber-toothed tigers, extinct bison, certain wolves, hippos, camels, which are not from the Arctic region, are found frozen up there. Probably killed during the flood, drowned because they're immersed in mud, and frozen and kept to this day, preserved. Let's look at the celestial bodies before the flood. The sun, moon, and stars are immediately visible through the waters above and the atmosphere after their creation. This region where this canopy would be above the atmosphere will support a reasonably large amount of water. As we've said, the radiation from the sun is sufficient to keep it in vapor form there. Since the vapor canopy would absorb solar radiation effectively, the warmer temperatures of the canopy would hold a large amount of water. They would give the earth, as we've said, a uniform temperature, and they protect life from destructive radiation. Secondly, the water canopy above the earth cannot be too dense, however. Even though the earth could support it, it's got enough radiation to pump a lot of vapor into the upper atmosphere. It can't be too dense because the light from the celestial bodies, from the stars and everything, would be absorbed or reflected by the water canopy and would not allow light to reach the earth's surface. I'll give you an example. Sunlight is totally absorbed by 3,000 feet of clear ocean water, leaving at 3,000 feet down total darkness. Water is a very good absorbent, even though it's transparent, of light radiation. Lastly, the speed of light, according to Einstein's special relativity, would be 186,000 miles per second, or 300,000 kilometers per second. If that was true, then the nearest star would not be seen before 4 years. So Adam and Eve would not have seen any stars in the sky for 4 years. Even more, none of the present galaxies that we see out there would be visible with our telescopes after 6,000 years. This speed of light becomes very important, and we'll cover this a couple times in these discussions of Genesis. The fixed speed of light of being 3,000 kilometers per second poses a very great difficulty for biblical believers of a young earth and universe. If it takes 20 billion years for light from the most distant galaxies to travel to the earth at a speed enshrined by Einstein's relativity, then that light had to be emitted 20 billion years ago, or it had to be created in transit. Einstein's special relativity would eliminate a credible young universe possibility. Conversely, it is impossible with the Big Bang theory. You think we have problems. The Big Bang theory, it would be impossible for the distant galaxies to travel out from a Big Bang to their present positions, even traveling at Einstein's speed, and then send light to the Earth in less than 20 to 40 billion years. They have a great problem. However, Maxwell, who developed our laws of electromagnetism, his 4 equations, derived from those equations the speed of light in the mid-1880s. This is 50 years before Einstein. And contrary to Einstein's 1905 special relativity, his derivation means that the speed of light will approach nearly infinite speeds in weak electromagnetic fields of deep space, far from the celestial bodies composed of all matter is made out of electrical subatomic particles, electrons and protons. These create electromagnetic fields that go out into infinite space. As you can see in this equation, C is equal to 1 over, and this is permeability times the square root of the permeability times the permittivity. These are just electromagnetic constants that vary with the strength of the fields. If the strength of the field becomes very small, because this is on the denominator, then the speed of light goes up. If these fields became very strong, like in a diamond, then the speed of light drops, just like Maxwell explained. However, celestial systems are made out of these charges. And as you move away from them, their fields become very weak. What does that mean to the speed of light? From Maxwell's derivation, it goes right through the ceiling. They'll never hit zero. These are infinite fields. There's no place that there's zero electromagnetic fields. However, the speed of light will approach infinity. What that means is Adam and Eve could have seen almost all of the 7,000 visible stars in today's sky on the 6th day of creation. Even more importantly, we today, with our most powerful telescopes, can see the most distant galaxies in 6,000 years later. Here we have a picture of a deep field shot that I've shown before. What it shows is they cranked up the Hubble telescope, aimed it out perpendicular to our plane into deep space. And all you see, there's only one star that it captured from our own galaxy, the Milky Way. The rest of these are all galaxies disappearing into the distance. We can actually see deep into space at least 13 billion, what they would say light years. It's actually closer to 10 to the 20th or 21st kilometers out there, disappearing into the distance. If these were from a Big Bang, they'd have to be blown out there and send light back to us in the same time. And that's not possible according to the laws of physics. These things would have burned out long ago. So what are we looking at in these deep field shots? New or ancient light? Is it Maxwell's true or Einstein? Do we have a new universe or an old universe? What was mankind like before the flood? We've talked a little bit about mankind after Adam and before Noah. But in the pre-flood human race, we'll call it the antediluvian. It's a fancy term. It means before the deluge or the flood. They had longevity. They averaged over 900 years old. Many of the antediluvian race were giants, according to Genesis 6:4. Probably, as we've mentioned, the product of fallen angels and the daughters of men, from 2 Peter 2:4 and Jude 6. These demigod giants, offspring of men and angels, were probably the basis of the heroes of ancient mythology: Atlas, Hercules, who had one human parent and one God parent. In contrast to the wickedness of this perverse generation, you have, as I mentioned, Enoch, whom God translated before the flood out of his evil generation. Enoch pronounced judgment on his generation. His rapture and godly life serve as a foreshadowing of the rapture of the church before the great tribulation that comes upon the earth. Before the flood of Noah, the sin of these ungodly sexual unions and the sinful actions of the antediluvian race resulted in God's judgment to destroy all land animals, including man, in the whole earth by a worldwide flood. Noah, as we've mentioned, a preacher of righteousness, is chosen by God to build an ark for the saving of himself, of his family, and of the mates of all the animals and birds on the earth. God has some provision also for and grace toward the animals and that existed in birds before. The flood will kill all land animals and birds of the antediluvian world and will change the geophysics of the earth and its climate forever. After the flood, we'll get to that later too, God establishes his covenant with Noah and his descendants. That's all of mankind now. Originally they came from Adam. They're destroyed except for this one line of Noah. And all of the humans that exist on the earth came from Noah and his descendants. He sets up a new dispensation for all of mankind, which continues to today. This new dispensation establishes human government. There was none before the flood of Noah. No police, no courts, no kings, etc. The governments are given a right of judgment, including capital punishment. They allow diets to eat for the eating of meat, and they place the fear of man in animals, God did. Also, as we've seen, the age of man declines exponentially over successive generations to 120 years, according to God's judgment to decrease man's lifespan. God's view of the antediluvian mankind. So God looked upon the earth, and indeed it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. Genesis 6:12. I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping things and birds of the air. Genesis 6:7. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Genesis 6:8. And God said to Noah, this is in Genesis 6:14, make an ark for yourself. He went, this is talking about Noah, and he preached to the spirits in prison, who formerly were disobedient, when once the divine long-suffering waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared. This is in 1 Peter 3:19-20. In other words, while Noah was building this ark, and it looks like it took 100 years because he began it in his 500th year and he finished it in his 600th year, and his sons helped him build this ark. And so during this period of time, he's preaching and he's telling these people judgment's coming. Of course, they probably laughed at him, these giants. Who's this guy? Who do we care what you say? And besides, you're a foolish man building a boat up on dry land at a time when there wasn't even any rain. What's significant about this too is that his father, Methuselah, died in the year of the flood. We have no mention of Methuselah, his father, helping him during these 100 years to build it. Or Lamech, his grandfather, who died 5 years before the flood. No mention of them helping him build this ark. Only he and his 3 sons, and their wives, of course, helping them. But during this period of time, Noah preaches, and he explains to them the judgment that's coming ahead because of their sinful ways. Just like his predecessor Enoch had told them before. Now the time is closing. God's judgment's determined, and Noah begins to build the ark. But he warns the people during this period of time. Of the clean animals, when the ark is finished, of the animals that were unclean, of the birds, and of everything that creeps on the earth, 2 by 2, they went into the ark with Noah. There's not a fear of man at this point. So it's easy to keep them together. There's not the killing, the claw and tooth among these animals. And all these animals, evidently even lions and what we consider carnivores, were eating vegetation. They're omnivores, so they can live on that. So all of these are gathered in the ark, 2 by 2. In the 600th year of Noah's life, on that day, all the fountains of the deep were broken up, and the windows of the heavens were opened. Noah entered this ark. It had a door on the side. He didn't have a way to close it, so God closes the door, seals it up, and then the fountains of the deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. So this picture shows the windows of the heavens opening up. Lightning storms begin. They've never seen that before. And on that day, the fountains of the deep burst forth. This is a picture of modern times in a tsunami of people running to get away from the water that's coming upon them. That was in Genesis 7:11. Now the flood was on the earth 40 days. In other words, the most violent part of this thing, of the fountains of the deep bursting forth and the windows of the heaven, lasts 40 days. This is in Genesis 7:17. During the flood, massive tectonic movements triggered worldwide volcanic eruptions. As the water ran to the lower places, it loaded the earth, and then these others are popped up, and it's forcing the earth with this accumulation of water, and it's probably the same amount of water we have today, begins to shove down. These other areas pop up, it breaks up the mantle of the earth, and volcanoes start to erupt out through these fissures. And they occur on a worldwide basis in a very short amount of time. Worldwide volcanic eruptions during the flood filled the atmosphere with volcanic ash. It pumps it up into the upper atmosphere, as we've seen in recent volcanoes. We had one within the last 2 centuries. One single volcano lowered the temperature of the whole earth by 3 degrees. Large amounts of volcanic ash in the atmosphere created massive storms during the flood, with lightning generated by the static alone coming out of this volcanic ash. These tectonic movements created eruptions during the flood, and they caused earthquakes and tsunamis in the oceans. Worldwide volcanic and tectonic earthquake activity during the flood created also these massive tsunamis. Massive tsunamis during the flood destroyed and buried animal and plant life. Tremendous amount of it. The waters then continued and they prevailed. And like I said, the earth is probably fairly flat at this point, even though these eruptions are taking place. And they prevailed over 15 feet upwards, and the mountains were covered. The reason we know that most of these things were fairly flat is even on the top of Mount Everest, the highest mountains that we have, they're all marine animals. The fossils are all marines. So these things were laid out fairly flat and then shoved up by these tectonic movements, and the volcanoes erupt in between them. And so these things covered the whole earth to 15 meters. There was not one bit of visible land at one point during this flood. And this is from Genesis 7:21. And all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, cattle, beast, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, and every man. The time is too late. When the door shut on the ark, the clock began. The violence of the flood waters displaced and deposited worldwide geological sedimentary layers by moving water. All our sedimentary layers are laid down by moving water. And they were laid down in a short amount of time. One of the reasons you know that is because these layers, if they've been exposed for any period of time, they would have erosion in the layers before the next layer was laid on top of it. These have no erosion marks. They're laid down in a very short amount of time by moving waters. All of them were laid down by water. Some say in the modern geology, they'll say they were in lakes and things. Where did the sediment come from? Out of the air? No, these are moving waters that laid down these sedimentary layers. Also, you have to cover up the animals and plants to make fossils out of them. They have to be covered up deep or they'll decay. Bacteria will eat them up. So this fast-moving water and all this water picks up all this sediment and starts laying it down in other places in geological sedimentary layers. The fountains of the deep, this is in Genesis 8, verses 2 and 3. The fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were stopped, and the rain from the heaven was restrained. So they had no rain before. In other words, the water canopies dropped and it's finished. The waters receded continually from the earth. In other words, they're resettling, and these other areas are sinking, the land starts to reappear out of it. The ark rested on the mountains of Ararat. This is in Genesis 8, verse 4. Noah looked, and indeed the surface of the earth was dried. Genesis 8, 14. What was the aftermath of that? What did Noah come out of the ark to find? What kind of a world was it? The Lord said to Noah, this is in Genesis 8:16, come out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing of all flesh. He then made a covenant with Noah, as we saw in the last session. He said, I will establish my covenant with you and your descendants. And of course, that's all of mankind. All of mankind has come from Shem, Japheth, and Ham. This is in 8:20, Genesis 8:20. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and offered burnt offerings on the altar. These were of the clean animals that he kept on the ark, 7 pairs, so he had some for sacrifices. And God said, I will set my rainbow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of a covenant between me and the earth. When Adam sinned, he went from the Garden of Eden to the world that existed before Noah. That continued, but it was a fall and a judgment, and it was less than they'd had before. And it was caused between an interchange between fallen angels, Satan in particular, and mankind. Now, in the time of Noah, we have this interchange again. It's a question of sin and God's judgment, and the world that's after the flood is a lot different than the world before. But God's made a covenant. I won't destroy it again by water. What was left after the flood? You have geological structures were left by the flood of Noah. Deep sedimentary layers full of fossils were deposited by the catastrophic flood waters over the whole face of the earth. What we have today is we call the 3 types of rocks we have. We have sedimentary, we have igneous rock, which comes, sedimentary is laid down by water. Igneous is volcanic. And then you have your metamorphic, which is things that existed before that are crushed by tremendous pressure, having been deep in the earth and then brought back to the surface again. But the sedimentary are very prominent because they're the ones that have the fossils in it. These were the things that were laid down. They're not igneous and they're not metamorphic. These were the ones that were laid down in the flood, trapping huge amounts of plants and animals. The world was full of those before the flood. There were also, as we're going to see, other structures were left. Their deep sedimentary layers were deposited. Some, such as the Grand Canyon, formed a fold up due to tectonic motion. Waters built up behind it and then cut through them. And they were cut through while they were still soft. These were not cut when they were hard. They were cut when they were still soft and sedimentary layers had been laid down, folded up, and then the waters cut through them and cut these deep trenches through them. In other places, you have deep sedimentary layers were folded without fracturing because they were still moist and soft by tectonic movements. This is a whole mountain of whole layers that are bent, and you cannot bend those when those are hard. They'll just shatter. These were all bent when they're soft, and they have, again, a lot of fossils and in them of plants and animals. It was laid down and then folded up and bent, and it had to be bent very shortly after they were laid down. You also have huge tropical forests were uprooted and deposited by the floodwaters, forming massive alluvial coal beds over the whole face of the earth. You find them all over Antarctica, up in the Arctic regions. You find them through Europe, Asia, the Americas, all over the earth, and they're made out of the same thing, the same types of plants. And these were trapped. They're not laid down by bogs or in the bottom of a lake or something else. They'll all decompose before they're compressed, but they were crushed down, compressed, and when you open them up, you can see the fossils, the trees. palms, and the lycopods form most of the coal beds. And they're very sharp seams. These were not, coal beds were not found where they were growing because they're sharp seams. There are no roots down inside of them. If there's any roots, the roots are integrated with the branches and the upper parts of the tree, and they're laid down. In some cases, you have trees going up through several layers with a limestone seam between them. And they're soft, they're coal. It's impossible to do by long periods of time. These things were suddenly buried and kept away from organic bacterial action that would have decomposed them. After the flood, volcanoes, because of the tectonics, would be pushing up new land masses and mountains with great violence. Volcanic islands were pushed up, and oceans before the flood, because of the canopy, were very warm. And they were pushed up and superheated also by these volcanoes pushing up through the thing. So the oceans at this point become very warm. They were warm before, they become even warmer because of the volcanic action. After the flood, the volcanoes continued. Noah's out, the flood ceased, but the volcanoes continued to erupt up through these fissures. And they bring valuable minerals and igneous rock to the earth's surface. Without the water canopy, the waters above, the post-flood world developed temperature zones with cold temperatures at both of the poles, and warm temperatures, in contrast, would have developed around its equator. So now, what you didn't have before, which the fossils indicate, your index fossils indicate, you don't have polar regions, you don't have temperature zones, they were all the same. Now you have at each pole very cold temperatures because there's no canopy to distribute the solar radiation equally over the whole surface, like it happens on Venus, which still has a canopy. So you get very warm temperatures at the equator and very cold temperatures at the poles. After the flood, these massive volcanoes caused by the flood tectonics ominously pumped ash, volcanic ash, into the atmosphere. Huge amounts, because they're all going off at the same time. They're not singular cases. There's a lot of them formed because of the flood. This volcanic ash from these massive eruptions filled the whole Earth's post-flood atmosphere. These volcanic ash clouds then blocked the solar radiation and rapidly cooled the atmosphere to very low temperatures. Do you see what's happening here? You got warm oceans. You all of a sudden have polar regions that are cold. But in addition to that, they're going to get even colder because this ash is blocking the sun's radiation. So they're going to be very, very cold in the north and the south poles. And they'll also be colder at the equator, but not as much as the poles. Cold atmospheric temperatures and massive volcanic eruptions triggered huge storms, especially in the new polar regions. In these new cold polar regions, these huge storms turned dramatically into snow blizzards. Volcanoes, this warm ocean temperature giving off lots of humidity, and very cold temperatures at the poles fueled massive polar snow blizzards day and night. This is a picture that you see of a recent one that was going off, and you can see the lightning going off in the thing, and it blocks the sun and lowers the temperature, and you have huge storms taking place, especially if you have a source from the new oceans that are very warm, pumping all this, or the larger ones, pumping all this humidity into the air, hitting these cold regions. The blizzards blanketed the polar landscapes with massive accumulations of snow day and night. Huge mammoths and other extinct animals, these are from the pre-flood, feeding on semi-tropical grasslands in northern Siberia, were trapped by the floodwaters and silt from that, and by the post-flood snows, then covered this thing and lowered these temperatures to freeze them in mass. Millions of pre-flood animals perished in the flood and were frozen by the post-flood snows. This is a picture here of one of these hairy mammoths. Here are the frozen remains of a mammoth that was found in Siberia almost 100 years ago, which was partially eaten by wolves after partial thawing that takes place in every spring and summer. This is taxidermy remains of the same mammoth from Siberia. The fierce polar snow blizzards begin to cover up the newly formed mountains and to fill the valleys. These are in the polar regions. Snow soon covered most of the newly formed mountains in the polar regions. Fed by moisture from the large warm oceans, the polar blizzards continued unabated. Descendants of Noah were driven back by the blizzards to the warmest parts of the earth near Babylon. As we stated before, around Babylon you have Babylon's the warmest capital in the world. And it was around this area that they came out and stayed during this tremendous snowstorms developing in the north and the south regions. Rapidly, the Ice Age snow covered all of the Earth's polar terrains. The deep snow compacted into Ice Age glaciers, often more than a mile deep. The Ice Age glaciers begin to move. They are pushed by large snow accumulations and pulled by gravity. These huge glaciers ground up everything in front of them, even mountains. These continental-sized glaciers changed all of the terrain, moving glacial materials hundreds of miles in a relatively short amount of time. Moisture to produce the intense but brief Ice Age snow and glaciers came from warm oceans, which lost 300 to 500 feet of depth during this period of time. As the volcanoes stopped, the atmosphere began to warm up again because it's not clouded, the solar radiation. The warm oceans, giving off all this humidity, begin to cool down in contrast, and the glaciers begin to melt. Great rivers created by the melting glaciers return the snow melt waters to the oceans. And that's why many of our even in the United States, many of our rivers are so much wider than they are today. Our rivers just meander down through them. Even during a flood, they may fill up the valley, but the current does. Whereas under the glacial melt, these things would have been filled up and cut these large river valleys like the Mississippi, the Missouri. You have others like the Kansas, which was at the southern edge of the glacial region. The melting Ice Age glaciers left a strange landscape and glacial deposits in their wake. Receding glaciers left sedimentary, igneous, and metamorphic rock, fossils, and minerals in glacial deposits down to the 38th parallel from both poles. So you have this Ice Age came all the way down to the 38th parallel from the north and the south poles, leaving only the equatorial zone unglaciarized. And that's what we find today, the remains of these glaciers. As far south as Kansas, Missouri in the United States, these huge deposits of stones, they call them erratics, brought from 700 or 800 miles north of here, crushing and leveling everything in their way. Huge tropical forests, uprooted and deposited by the flood deposits, form massive alluvial coal beds and oil fields for the Earth's energy supplies. In other words, our energy supplies are residues of the flood action, leaving coal deposits and oil deposits that were buried during this period of time. The deep sedimentary layers over the whole Earth were deposited, folded, and cut through by the huge flood waters while still soft. The massive alluvial layers from the Noahic flood and the glacial Ice Age are the basic building materials for modern civilization. Our rock coming out of the sedimentary layers and our sands from the glacial deposits, ground up and left for us to build our civilizations out of. It'd be very difficult to build without these two basic building blocks. Science and its laws harmonize with the biblical creation, the fall of man, and the Noahic flood, the two judgments that came after the creation. The basic laws of science originated in two historical events, as we've seen in Genesis 1 and 3. The first law with Genesis 1, conservation of matter and energy, and 2, the increasing entropy or disorder of the second law with the curse in Genesis 3. The physics, as we have seen, of the speed of light from Maxwell supports the biblical account of a young universe. Geological records agree with the biblical account of the pre-flood earth conditions, climatic, environmental, geophysical, and biological. The fossil records confirm the biblical account of the pre-flood plants and animals, where you had almost 100 times more than you have today, spread evenly over the earth. Sedimentary, igneous, and metamorphic formations confirm the biblical account of a catastrophic worldwide flood and the post-flood ice age, which can't be explained in any way of the climatic conditions according to uniformitarianism. Also, the recent floods, volcanic eruptions, and tsunamis that we've had and earthquakes in modern times confirm on a small scale the effects of a biblical worldwide flood. We had one tsunami and it killed a minimum of 250,000 people in just a matter of hours. And that was on a small scale. That wasn't worldwide. Glacial deposits that we find out there verify the biblical post-flood ice age. You go out there, these were glaciers that were all the way down into Kansas, Missouri, Ohio, and it meant that it was ice in the middle of August. Impossible to arrive at in any other way than a post-flood ice age. Modern physics, geology, astronomy that's taught, and biology of secular humanism, or secular naturalism, I should say, cannot explain the origins or the present conditions of the earth, universe, or life. Scientific laws and data confirm God's creation of the universe and the catastrophic worldwide results of God's judgment in the flood, contrary to naturalism's, and I put it in quotes, science. Again, I want to thank you, and I will carry on our next session looking into the world that took place after the flood and what mankind did in that period of time leading to another judgment. Thanks.